Okay. Good morning. Good to see everybody that is here. Jackie is not feeling well. She's going to have to... She was texting me earlier, make an appointment with her doctor. She's been having foot and ankle problems for the last couple of weeks, and she says it's getting worse. So we need to remember her in our prayers today while we're here together, and then, of course, as we leave and are separated. This morning we won't have a test. We did take up homework sheets, and then when you leave today you'll get new, fresh homework sheets. And the way that we're going to be doing this is the things that are on your homework sheets will be how we start formulating new tests. And so this will be homework, and also too, the way that you get your answers to homework questions is most of it's going to be in the class today. So it's like, right, this is 3 ways for us to remember what we're going over. You have the class, have your homework, you take your test. We're trying to solidify information in our heads. So you'll get that at the end of class, and you'll probably get to have these back by the time that you leave. And that way you get to do more of your study. Okay. Now, this morning we're going to start, and let's talk about this too, how the class is going, and we'll go. So 2 weeks ago I introduced, and we had the discussion of why have this type of class anyways. And the reason that we said is a lot of congregations will bemoan the fact that church discipline never happens, and we said that the reason church discipline hardly ever happens is because people don't know the Bible well enough to define sin or remember where the actual sin is located, so where we can put a scripture on it and it not be so vague as people saying, well, I didn't like that. Well, nobody cares what you liked or didn't like. We want to know, is it lawful or unlawful? And that's the problem people run into. And then Ian did the second class, and he talked about how you can't, people say, well, we want to talk about love, grace, and mercy. You cannot separate love from the idea of studying sin. And all the scriptures that he presented was, specifically when I remember in Ephesians chapter 4, you stop doing certain things so that you, in a loving manner or loving concern for your fellow man, start doing good things. They're all attached. So what I'm saying all that to say is, we will still come in here on different Sundays, and we may not talk about a specific sin. We may have like a discussion like Ian presented last time, or my first class. And 2, this morning we're talking about to covet or covetousness. We will have a part 2 on this, that we're not going to do everything just in this class today. And so it'll be just like any of the other classes Ian and I have done, where just because I'm doing covetousness today, Ian might come along later and say, I have more information on covetousness that I'd like to go over. So before we look at our information this morning, I have a question to get us going. Okay, now I'll ask it 2 ways. Where does faith come from? Okay, that's Romans 10:17. Faith comes by hearing the Word of God. What is the New Testament definition? I mean, it says faith is. What is a working definition of faith according to the New Testament? Okay. Hebrews 11:6. It says, let's see, not 11:6. 11:1. Faith, now Mark said evidence. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. So, how does the world usually portray the idea of faith? Okay, a leap in the dark, you're feeling it out, and somehow you get the confidence based on nothing at all to make this huge jump. That is not the biblical idea of faith. So here's another thing. When we were in school, somebody asked me, they said, if you could get rid of any one sin in the world, what would it be? And I know that back then somebody said homosexuality, somebody said abortion. And I'm telling you right now, sin, misconceptions, what have you, if I could fix the one thing, is I would wish that the world could see the difference between the Church of Christ and the sectarian world. Now, they're all out there, I'm saying religious folk are out there saying, well, you can't know the truth, and there's all these other things, better felt than told. I wish that we could at least get people the information, right? If they had the information, they could start making better choices, and those other sinful activities might be worked out by them getting information. I wish that they could have a split line of this is what really the Bible says and this is just what religious folk do. And I wish that we didn't have to combat those misconceptions, but we do. And so this is how I want to start this morning. Faith is not a leap in the dark. Faith is a substance, and it says it's the evidence of things that you haven't seen. So no man has seen God, but we do have evidence for his existence. Now, with that thought in mind, breaking the common idea of what faith is, a leap in the dark, what would you say about covetousness? You can say this is my idea of covetousness. You can use a Bible passage and say this is what the Bible says about covetousness. Or we were taking answers right now as someone to say this is what the world says about covetousness. Mark. Okay, and that's Colossians 3, right? Mark said Colossians 3 says covetousness is idolatry. So what that ends up shaking out to be is we have to recognize, let's go back to 3:5. This is Colossians 3:5. Covetousness, which is idolatry. You may not carve out a wooden or a metal image and say, well, this represents the God I believe in. But whatever your full devotion starts leaning towards, then you have to say, that's my idol. Like, people, I'm saying they just work so hard to fulfill their car payment. They spend all their time working on their car. They spend all their time maintaining their car. You might as well say that's your idol. Now, okay, Mark gave us the scripture, Colossians 3:5. Anything else?
Could it be that you're envious of what your neighbor has and you want it?
Okay, so those are two different things. Now, you seeing what your neighbor has and wanting what your neighbor has, and so we have to, that's okay, because we're going to have another class on it in the future. Covetous does not necessitate envy, but it will lead there. So envy is something is actually going to be a separate thing, but would you say dissatisfaction? Okay, so Betsy would say it's seeing what other people have, which then creates an unnecessary dissatisfaction in yourself. Because what you have is fine, it's doing the job, right? A lot of times when we see other people, they have things, what they have is usually not anything more special than what we have. It just has a different label on it, maybe they paid more for it. Okay, anything else? Betsy says something that creates dissatisfaction in yourself. Desire that creates dissatisfaction in what you have. Mark said it's idolatry. Okay. Okay, that's going to be another thing it leads to. Coveting your neighbor's wife could lead to adultery. Okay, let's get into this. Now, I'll tell you, I would like to dispel with I think it's a shallow idea. How does like the sectarian community or even the non-believing, they have the idea of covetousness. What do they usually say is coveting? When you're talking to them about portions of the truth and they're trying to show that you're not a perfect person, they say, well, you covet. What do? What's the illustration? Okay, they say, this is how people usually say it, and it's always towards men. You're driving down the road and you see a good-looking woman, and they say, you look too long. I'm saying that's not covetousness. Now, someone would say, you still shouldn't be looking too long. I recognize that I shouldn't be looking that long, possibly, but that's not the idea that's actually presented in the book. And we've talked about that before, too. I cannot help that I'm driving down the road and some women are going to wear next to nothing as they go outside. I can't do anything about that. And I also cannot help that I have a natural appreciation for the opposite sex. I couldn't do anything about that, and I can't help how they choose. And someone says, well, you have a choice as to where your eyes go. That's true. But just because I see that and then have natural appreciation for it does not actually give the constitution of what the Bible calls covetousness. Now let's look at this. Conversation. Is all covetousness bad? Oh. Okay, so it sounded like I heard two no's and one yes. And then I started hearing like definite ideas. Okay, this is just in the slides because this is what happens. You start talking with somebody and you might really have the true position. And this is just the way that it goes. It shouldn't be this way, but it is the way that things are. You have the truth, they don't. But they do happen to catch you on something that you didn't know. And now how do you look in the conversation? If you didn't know that, then maybe you don't actually know what you're trying to really talk about. Let's look at this. In 1 Corinthians 12:31, I don't know if somebody said this, covet earnestly the best gifts. Okay, Paul is talking to Christians and he tells them, y'all need to covet this. Now, we can look at this and someone would say, well, that doesn't apply to us because we don't have spiritual gifts anymore. I get that, but this is just for the argument's case. Not all covetousness is going to be bad. He says, covet earnestly the best gifts, and yet I shown you a more excellent way. I think if we would say it this way, if they were coveting the best gifts and he says there's a more excellent way, should we covet the more excellent way? I would say yes. Luke 22:15, look at what Jesus said. Now, here's a point to be made. Just so you know for your notes. In 1 Corinthians 12:31, that is not necessarily when he says covet. Zelo, however you want to pronounce that Greek word, zelu, is not the same word that you're going to find down here in Romans 7. Paul says, I had not known covetousness, or I had not known lust, except the law said, thou shalt not covet. Someone would say, well, that's a different word. That's fine. I'll give it to you. That's a different word. But when you come to Luke 22:15, Jesus said, with desire, I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. And that is the exact same word as Romans 7, where Paul says, I would not have known lust, except the law had said, thou shalt not covet. But Jesus just says, I have been coveting this time together. So when we look at it this way, what is covetousness in this context? Okay, it is a very strong desire. It does not have to mean that it's bad. Context is going to determine whether it's good or bad. Ian?
Can we say, like, with the implication that you're actually feeding it?
Okay, that's going to be another thing. We're going to get there. Ian says, now, you're saying about the bad way, right?
Yeah, like I'm saying, I can have in short order a strong passion towards something, but then I'm not going to spend my days feeding that, orienting myself.
Okay, so Ian says there are going to be things that I desire, but he says the distinguishing factor is going to be, do I feed the desire? Mark?
You have a strong desire to do good to your neighbor, and you have a strong desire not to do good. So which one's best?
And the same thing that he just said then about, I can say, well, I'd like to do good to my neighbor, but then I actually never end up doing anything good. That's the same thing. It's like I had a desire for a bad thing, but I didn't feed it. We can also not feed our good intentions also. So, here we are. This would be something worthy of taking note over. Is all covetousness bad? No. And these are our examples. And it does, like someone says that's a different word, it'd be worthy of taking a note on that. Okay. And the end goal too, I will say this. Y'all, we should be getting used to writing in our Bibles, because this is the type of stuff that comes up in the conversations. You go to 1 Corinthians 12:31, you don't remember the word. I'm not going to remember the word. And then you go to Luke 22:15, you're not going to remember the word, but you're going to have to bring it up at some point with somebody who maybe knows a little bit of other stuff. Now let's move on to this. This is a very good section if you want to talk to somebody about covetousness. In Romans 7:7-9, he says, what shall we say then? Is the law sin? God forbid. Nay, I had not known sin, but by the law. For I had not known lust, except the law had said, thou shalt not covet. But sin, taking occasion by the commandment, wrought in me all manner of concupiscence, for without the law sin was dead. For I was alive without the law once, but when the commandment came, sin revived, and I died. Now, why this is good is we actually start getting an understanding that these terms are all the same. Lust, covet, and down here where it says concupiscence, and really the idea of concupiscence is it would say inordinate affection for forbidden things. And I would then bring that in the idea of what Ian said about, am I feeding the desire? I'm going to have desires all over the place. It then turns into, what am I doing about it? Am I feeding it, or am I trying to fight against it? And then also, as you look at this conversation, he says, I had not known lust, except the law had said, thou shalt not covet. But sin, taking occasion by the commandment, wrought in me all manner of concupiscence. And this is what I think that we should also be talking about in our conversations about covetousness. And the idea of Romans 7. A lot of times, well, this is the thing. Who in here agrees it's good not to covet? Nobody's going to disagree with that. Now, do you covet? Okay. And this is what he's saying. The problem with sin, and I'm saying the law and our ability to keep law, is occasions. And this is what I mean by that. We look at certain situations, and that's what Paul's going to say when he gets into Romans about 7, verse number 16. He says, the things that I'd like to do, I don't do them. The things that I hate, I end up doing them. And then in verse 16, he says, but I consent that the law is good. And so an illustration that Dad uses about taking occasion, he says, I would not know lust except the law. It says, thou shalt not covet. And the illustration that Dad used was a mother talks to her very young daughter about boys. I don't know if like they're having the full-blown talk, or they're talking about things to be watchful for when you start dating. And the little girl says, like, the little girl hears it, and she takes knowledge of it, but she says, I don't even like boys. And so what's she thinking? Maybe this is useless knowledge. I don't even like them. But when the occasion starts to arise, we need to be informed. And even then someone says, well, the occasion has arisen, we were informed, and we still fell prey to it. We're not saying that's a good thing, but we are saying that that is bound to happen. Now, before we really dive in, these are some good quotes. This is out of a book called, it's a set of books, it's a set of dictionaries. Kittle's Theological Dictionary of the New Testament. And this is why I started with Hebrews 11:1. Faith is the evidence of things not seen. Faith, the Christian lifestyle, is a reasoned out lifestyle. You have to be thinking, and this is what we say about playing chess. When you make a move in chess, what are you really supposed to be thinking about? You should be thinking about at least the next 2 or 3 moves when you're playing chess, and that's what people ought to be doing. Like Christians, and someone says, well, that sounds like it's taxing. It's protective. So this is what we're saying. Individuals take a job, they should be looking beyond saying, well, I will be making a lot of money if I take this particular job, okay? 2, 3 moves ahead. How many Sundays are you going to have to work? Are they going to be messing with you about that? You might possibly be making a lot of money. Is it a good work environment? I mean, let's really talk about these things 2, 3 steps ahead, and that's going to be a form of covetousness. So here's how non-biblical people thought about this word. It's a Greek word, right? Non-Christians are using this word, and this is how they thought about it. Non-Christians, non-believing Greeks in the first century, when they said the Greek word for covetousness, they thought of it as the waywardness of a man in conflict with his own rationality. So, what does that mean? Waywardness of a man in conflict with his rationality.
Illogical behavior.
Okay. We start making choices based on what we want when people that are standing by can say, look at us and say, you know that doesn't make sense. But the person says, I know it, but I want it. Waywardness of man in conflict with his rationality. Second quote, covetousness is evil. This was the idea of people in the first century in a religious connotation. Covetousness is evil not because it is irrational, but because it is disobedience to the command of God. But does this quote not actually still say it is in fact irrational?
Yeah, the only thing that's different is who's setting the goal.
Okay. But I will say this. Ian says the only difference between this quote and this quote is who determined that it was, the end was bad. I'm going to be honest with you. I would like for us to get away from that idea. When somebody said, this person said, it's evil, not because it's irrational, but because it's the disobedience to the command of God. I'm trying to get people away from the idea that God arbitrarily makes law. Just random. God says, don't fornicate. Well, why? God said don't do it, don't do it. That's bad thinking. There's a lot of reasons as to why God said don't fornicate. I would rather that we just stick with this idea. It causes the waywardness of a man in conflict with his rationality. Quote number 3. The view is reached that desire is the chief of all sins. The will of God can be expressed in a single formula, not to desire. Now, there's a lot to be said about this, and that's why I said we're going to have a part 2. Don't desire. Okay, God says these certain things, don't desire them, but then what does He also say about our particular desires? Okay, He knows we would have them, and so some of them, He says, put them in a specific realm. Everybody has sexual desire. So what did God say? He says, get married, 1 Corinthians chapter 7. So, someone says, well, is it wrong to desire all the time, anything? No. If it's in its proper realm, it's okay. We all got to eat. You don't have to be what the Bible would say, a glutton, and we see a lot of that. So, there's going to be discussions for this, but we are going to look at desire this morning, and it's going to be on the basis of the waywardness of a man in conflict with his rationality. So let's get moving. And I do have this one more. Covetousness is desire as impulse. And this is my point too, though. That statement by itself is not good enough. We all have impulses. And what's the point of saying, I acted on an impulse? And maybe let's take away the word I acted on. Let's just say I had an impulse. Okay, he says covetousness is desire as an impulse. We're saying, why is that statement not enough?
Well, the idea is, so an impulse, if something's like really truly an impulse, the implication of something being an impulse is I don't really have 100% conscious control.
Okay, you can't start saying like I'm at fault for an impulse when the definition of impulse is you didn't have control over it to begin with. That's why I said take the word act out of it. I acted on an impulse. I could have had an impulse, gotten control of myself, and then said, we're not doing that. Okay. Covetousness is desire as impulse. Is anxious, self-seeking, bursts upon him with the force of immediacy. Now, let's talk about this. Is it, and I think what these quotes are saying, I think they're good information that give us time to talk. Is it a sin to be tempted? Okay, no. You can be tempted and then say no. If we're saying that covetousness is desire, and we saw it from Luke 22, it's a very, very strong desire. That's why I'm saying we need to get away from the idea of I saw a good-looking woman and I said, she's good-looking. And whatever these realms might be, somebody walks by the liquor store that's always had a problem with drinking, and then they just say, I got that taste going. I got that feeling going, but I went home. That's not the same idea. So let's talk about that particular illustration. Ian said earlier, and we're going to look at it to the idea, Ian said it's the idea of feeding it. So if I had a problem with drinking, how would I possibly be feeding my covetousness for drinking before I've actually started drinking again? What would I be doing? That's it. If I'm going to continuously say, well, I got to get home, and I always have to drive by the liquor store, all I'm doing, like you said earlier, concupiscence, I'm creating a longing for what I've had in the past and just giving myself and really... So, are there things like that you can think of and you can taste it without actually having it? Okay, so if you go by and you just give yourself an imaginative moment of, boy, I remember that. That's feeding the covetousness. And how someone say, well, I don't know about that. How hard is it and how smart would it be to actually reroute yourself to not go down that way? And then you're saying, because then you don't want to go back down that road. So let's think about these things and let's start looking at some real examples. This is Joshua chapter 7. And this morning we're only using 2 illustrations from the Old Testament, and when I come back we'll use more for covetousness because I want to really bring this in. So in Joshua 6, they have this command. They're going to take the city of Jericho, and they're going to have it done in a miraculous fashion, right? They walk around one time a day, James.
They're supposed to walk around 7 days.
Once a day for 6 days, and then on the 7th day, they do it more than once. They blow the trumpets, they shout, and then the walls fall outward. So it's all a miraculous thing to basically show the God of Israel and not their particular power. And so this is a command that they had. When you destroy the city of Jericho, he says, the city shall be accursed, even it and all that are therein, to the Lord. Only Rahab the harlot shall live, she and all that are with her in the house, because she hid the messengers that we sent. And ye in any wise keep yourselves from the accursed thing, lest you make yourselves accursed when you take of the accursed thing, and make the camp of Israel accursed and trouble it. All the silver, gold, and vessels of brass and iron are consecrated unto the Lord. They shall come into the treasury of the Lord. So what's the command here? God tells Joshua and the people, when you take Jericho, what?
All the spoils,
Okay. The only thing you can take are these particular metals. They go into the national treasury that takes care of everybody. So what he's really saying is individuals don't just get to start grabbing everything that you see. These particular things, they go to the treasury of the Lord. He says individuals don't get to go in and just start taking everything that they want. Here's Joshua 7:1. The children of Israel committed a trespass in the accursed thing, for Achan, the son of Carmi, the son of Zabdi, the tribe of Judah, took the accursed thing, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against the children of Israel. So you've got the command, Joshua 6. Here's the breaking of the command, and here is the explanation of why he did it. And Achan answered Joshua and said, indeed, I have sinned against the Lord God of Israel, and thus have I done. When I saw among the spoils a goodly Babylonian garment, 200 shekels of silver, a wedge of gold of 50 shekels weight. Here's what we're saying. Here's our study. He says, I coveted them and took them, and behold, they are hid in the earth in the midst of my tent, and the silver underneath it. Now, let's start talking about our definition that we're using from, and when we say our definition, not like we came up with this out of thin air. We're saying covetousness is the waywardness of a man in conflict with his rationality. Now, based on this event, God says, don't take these things. Achan says, when I saw it, I coveted and I did it. If covetousness is the waywardness of a man that causes him to conflict with his own rationality, what would you say was irrational about this decision?
I'm going to somehow get away with this before the God that just brought down the walls of Jericho.
Okay. Now, Ian says, I'm somehow going to get away with this. He should have known he's not going to get away with it. Like, he basically he says it's hidden in my tent. So what has he had to do?
His family has to know something.
Okay, he enlisted people to basically keep my sin a secret. You're not secret. It's already been seen. Okay, what else is irrational?
He's not going to be able to spend it if people...
Okay, man. He says, I saw this good stuff, and I said, I'd like to have that. What you going to do with it? Because you can't wear it, and everybody's going to say, where'd you get that Babylonian garment? You can't spend all this money because people are going to say, man, where'd you get all this money? Now, let's look at these points. This picture, y'all, of James 1, or Joshua 7, is what James 1:13 talks about. Let no man say when he is tempted, I'm tempted of God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man, but every man is tempted when he's drawn away of his own lust and enticed. Then, when lust has conceived, it brings forth sin, and sin, when it is finished, bringeth forth death. Now, here's our point that we made earlier. Look, he says you're already drawn away of your own lust. But still, you're at the point where actual sin has not taken place. Having desires is human, but you do not have to fulfill those desires all the time, and you also don't have to feed those desires. He says you're drawn away of your own lust and enticed. When lust has conceived, it brings forth sin, and then sin brings forth death. So we saw that with Achan. He says, I saw it, I coveted it, I took it. You see it, you want it, you do it. Those 3 points are in James 1:13 through 15, just like they're in Joshua 7. So now let's ask this way. Ian gave us a couple points as to how it was not rational for him to do this. It was not rational for him to disobey God, think it was going to be kept secret, and then also when you got all this stuff, you have no way of enjoying it because it's always kept a secret. Now, let's do it this way. Achan, in Joshua 6 and 7, how can you actually rationalize his behavior?
Simple.
What could he have been thinking when he did it?
Get away.
He might have been thinking, why did we get to do this when we left Egypt, but we don't get to do it now? 21 and 22. Give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, and it shall come to pass that when you go, you shall not go out empty, but every woman shall borrow of her neighbor and of her that sojourneth in her house jewels of silver, jewels of gold, and raiment, and you shall put them upon your sons and upon your daughters, and you shall spoil the Egyptians. So, there's plenty of ways for an individual to start trying to rationalize it, but is there really any point in this when you find Joshua 6 says don't do it? He could have been saying in Joshua 7, let's ask this question. The gold and the silver and then the Babylonian garment, are those things inherently evil? He could have been saying that. This is just material. It's not like these things hold any real value. What wrong am I doing? So there were ways for him to do this, but now let's do this, how he abandoned reason. I think I would lend this to what Ian said about you did just see God destroy miraculously an entire city and you think you're going to somehow escape it. Not only that one point, but Leviticus 10, I think he would have been alive. Whether he were alive or not, he surely would have known about Nadab and Abihu, struck dead in Leviticus chapter 10. Numbers 11:32, they all start complaining because they don't have meat. And then God sends a plague on all the people who are complaining. Numbers 12, Miriam starts having her feud with Moses. God turns her into a leper. Numbers 13, the people who said we can't take the promised land, the people are too big, they'll overpower us. That entire generation died in the wilderness. Number 16, Korah, Dathan, and Abiram were swallowed up by the earth because they challenged Moses' authority that was given him by God. And then Numbers 20, verse number 12, Moses himself does not get to come into the promised land. And all we're saying about this is, this is the illustration I always use. Why did I not have to get spanked when I was a kid? I paid attention that Micah got in trouble for doing it, so I avoided it. That's the rational, that's in Proverbs. Why? Not like that's just a natural thing for me as like a 7-year-old. I don't want to get spanked. But wise people pay attention to the problems that other people are having, and if it's self-induced, they say, I'm not going to self-induce that on myself. He had the knowledge that these type of things are done by God, who had the ability to see everything they were doing. He abandoned the reason in that sense, but here's some more points. Someone then says, we ask the question, well, it sounds like God arbitrarily decided you're not going to take the gold this time, because they got to do it back in Exodus 3 and Exodus 14, but now you're not. So let's talk about this. Do you have any ideas as to why God might have said, don't do this? Now, let's look at this. It's not like he said, don't take anything. The spoils of the precious metals They went to Israel. And so if the community is taken care of, is Achan taken care of? He's okay. It's not like God is, having... Let's make another point about what he had seen. Where did these folk, they're wandering for 40 years, where did they get their shoes and their clothes?
God miraculously extended the lifespan.
Okay, God preserves their garments. It's not like God sends them out into the wilderness and says, okay, y'all be miserable for 40 years. So if the people are taken care of, Achan is taken care of, God's taking care of these people. It wasn't just a random statement of we don't get to spoil anything out of this. They were taking things that they had need of. Now, God says the individuals don't get to take these certain things. What type of message would you think could be sent to the Canaanites if the people of Israel are not plundering? Mark.
Genesis 14:23, what Abraham said.
Okay, that's it. Mark brings up Genesis 14, which is going to be a little further down, isn't it? Where Abraham makes that statement.
I think verse 23.
Okay. 23? Okay. All right. Abraham goes out to the battle with all these individuals trying to get his nephew Lot back, and at the end of it, now does Abraham take some spoils? He takes enough to say our expenses and care for the people, but then after that he says, I will not take from a thread even to a shoe latchet, and that I will not take anything that is thine, lest thou should say, I have made Abraham rich. Now, how had the city just been destroyed? Every bit of it was miraculous, even to the fact that the walls fell outward. If a city is invading, the walls go inside. Now, if the Canaanites here, man, these people are taking cities and it's not about getting stuff, what does it then become? It's a righteous crusade, which is Deuteronomy 7. These are sinful people. And it's when we say sinful people, the 7 Canaanite nations, it's not like they were, we say sinful people. Everybody sins. These people were, Genesis 15:16 says they had reached just like total corruption. What's the actual word? Filled? Their iniquity is not filled. That's it. Let's have it on the screen just so we all know. Okay. For the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. If there was an evil way to do something, they were finding it. And that's why God says now they're not suitable neighbors for anybody and they need to be removed. Well, the fact that they're not plundering on an individual basis is showing the Canaanites these people are on a righteous crusade. It's not just about coming out and getting stuff. And then they also need to have this idea too. They're in the book of Joshua, they're in the conquest stage. They're not in the settling down stage. So how are your movements? You got 9 areas west side of the Jordan that you're fixing to have to take from the Canaanites. Now, if everybody's mass accumulating stuff, how effective are they going to be? They're not effective. Then we're in the conquest stage. This is not the time frame for all y'all to be looting everything that you see. We're in the conquest. We're not in the settling stage. Okay, now that's Joshua 7. One more before we close. Numbers, this is different. Now, the way that he left his reason, we said, was he had all this evidence to know he wasn't going to get away with it. He should have reasoned, I'm not going to get to enjoy it. But now let's look at these people. Numbers 11. Now Achan admitted in Joshua 7, he said, I saw it and I coveted it. Look at how this text says it. The mixed multitude that was among them fell a lusting. That's coveting. The children of Israel also wept again and said, who shall give us flesh to eat? We remember the fish which we did eat in Egypt freely, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now our soul is dried away. There is nothing at all beside this manna before our eyes. Now, Numbers 11, here's their lust. Numbers 11:31-34, here's the response. God gives them the meat that they want, and then in verse 33, he smites them with a plague, And then it says, because there was buried the people that lusted. Okay, the lust, the fulfilling of the lust, and now let's ask this. Can you rationalize this? In their mind, they say, we want meat. We're out here with no meat. What's wrong with that?
Well, I mean, I think it was said that why did God call us out here to kill us?
Okay. And
That the solution is worse than the original idea.
okay, there's nothing wrong with them saying, we wish we had meat, and this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to get the idea of you're losing your reasoning. There's nothing wrong with wanting meat. The problem, and you see that in Acts 10, rise, kill, and eat. Don't call what I have cleansed uncommon. What is it? God hath cleansed, call that not common. It's not the problem of wanting meat. It's how they actually abandoned their reason and they started desiring Egypt. You claim that you want meat so badly that you would actually go back to a place that not only had enslaved you, but they murdered your babies. Every baby child under 2 years old was killed by the Egyptians. And you say, boy, we had the meat back then. And then you had everything else attached to it. Now let's look at this. So does anybody, we were talking about this the other day, if you listen to Dave Ramsey, the financial advisor, when you're trying to come out of debt, do you know what Dave Ramsey tells you to eat? That's it. Rice and beans. No meat, Dave Ramsey? And he says, if you want to climb out of your hole, you're going to have to sacrifice. Now, these folk wanted to come out of bondage, and you know they wanted to, and they wanted to get away from an atmosphere where their babies are being killed, but then they turn all that upside down and say, we don't have any meat out here. That's life. It's filled with sacrifice. There are people who come to this country, and they recognize, they say, we can have a better run in America than where we are now. And they say, when we get to America, all we're going to do is eat rice and beans. What are you eating right now? If you're in the Marshall Islands, rice, no beans. So it's not that bad. They abandoned all their reason. Here's something else they did. And y'all, this is what we don't think about when we start our complaining. I doubt that they thought this was going to happen. Do you think those people, I think it would be hard not to. Do you think that they had built up appreciation for Moses yet? You don't think? I know that when he comes in, they basically look at him as an outsider because he was raised up in the house of Pharaoh. But he is the person who just brought y'all out. I mean, if you're not saying, God did it, but God did it through Moses. But they big time discouraged him because when you look at the text of Numbers 11, he actually has a conversation with God and he says to God, if these people are going to keep on this way, just kill me now. But this is what I'm saying. We all do this to each other the more and more that we complain. Look, if you don't like the circumstances, fix the circumstances. But if we're not taking any action, all we're doing is talking, and that stuff gets old real fast. Hebrews 12:12, he says to lift up the hands that are feeble and strengthen the knees of those who are feeble. And they greatly discourage this individual. And you notice at the end of Numbers 11, he says that all the people who lusted were killed. Not everybody in that time frame was lusting, right? There were some people who were full, they were satisfied. We're out here in the wilderness, but it beats Egypt. Unless someone says, well, all we got out here is manna, and they say, it beats Egypt. What they did was they possibly could have created dissatisfaction in others, and then led them to start having really the covetous ideas. And Matthew 18:7 says, woe to the person who brings about offense in somebody else. It's better for a millstone to be hanged about their neck. And here's the last point. Before they died, all their covetousness was doing was making themselves miserable. Well, at this point now, you couldn't go back to Egypt if you really wanted to. Like if they said, well, we're going to go back to Egypt. You're not going to get to go back there. You'd be executed if you went back there. So you have no choices. You're here, so you might as well make the best of it. And 1 Timothy 6:9-10, he says that contentment with godliness is great gain. And then he talks about feeding the desires, feeding the endless chase of desires, he says, brings about misery. Okay, this morning we'll stop here. I don't know what Ian has planned for next week, but I can say that we'll come back 2 weeks from now and have a discussion, part 2 of covetousness. And then we also have homework for individuals to take home today. Okay, questions, comments? Okay, nothing else. We'll take our break. We have the duty roster